We're at the Bigelow House on the east side of Olympia, one of the city's oldest homes, built by 1860, a great example of the Carpenter Gothic style. It was built by Daniel and Anne Elizabeth White Bigelow. Both came over the Oregon Trail in the early 1850s. Daniel Bigelow was from upstate New York. He went to college at Union College in Schenectady, New York, later read law at Harvard, and then decided he would come to the Oregon country and set off over the Oregon Trail in 1851. We know quite a lot about what life was like for Daniel Bigelow on the Oregon Trail because we have his diary. We also know that he brought several items with him when he crossed the Oregon Trail, and some of those are still in the house, including the desk that I'm standing by here. Being a lawyer, he brought at least the top part of this desk as a stand-up desk to use in his law practice. He also brought a lot of law books. Well, Daniel and Anne Elizabeth married in 1854, and we have their wedding picture here in the house. They later had a very large family that lived here in the Bigelow House. When Daniel Bigelow arrived in Olympia in November of 1851, he set up his law practice, and he evidently was a great orator as well. He was called upon to give the 4th of July oration in Olympia in July of 1852, and that's widely credited with spurring the development of a separate territory for Washington from Oregon. Well, Washington did become a separate territory from Oregon in 1853, and Daniel Bigelow was elected to the very first legislative session held here in Olympia, and he recounted it here in his diary. February 8th, the first election for Washington Territory is passed. Columbia Lancaster elected delegate to Congress, myself, one of the councilmen for Thurston County in the legislature. He was very much an advocate of education. He was also an advocate for equal rights. We know from his diary that he was very interested in women's rights and rights for people of color. In fact, he worked very hard to get a mixed-race man and his wife their land claim, George and Isabella Bush. Daniel Bigelow himself had already decided to take advantage of the Oregon donation law that granted free land to settlers to the Oregon country. And in the house, we have several examples of certificates for his land claims. Because George Bush was a man of color, he was unable to claim his rights as Daniel Bigelow and others did. And so Bigelow led the effort in the territorial legislature to memorialize Congress to grant George and Isabella Bush their land, which eventually was accomplished. We're now entering one of the formal rooms of the house, and this chair played an important role of the history of the Bigelow House and indeed the Pacific Northwest. We know that Daniel and Anne Elizabeth Bigelow were both active in the campaign for voting rights for women, and this is the chair where Susan B. Anthony sat when she came to the house in 1871. She and Abigail Scott Duniway, the Oregon suffragist, were on a swing through the Pacific Northwest, and she had dinner here at the Bigelow House. We know that from her diary, where she called Mrs. Bigelow splendid. At the time, there was a lot of advocacy for women's right to vote. Daniel Bigelow was serving in the territorial legislature, and in fact, he gave a landmark speech about women's suffrage. He said, "If I understand the principles of self-government, man has no more right to say that woman shall or shall not vote then woman has to say the same of man. As a matter of natural right, I know of no valid argument to deny franchise to woman any more than to man. In our form of government, the more universal the right of franchise, the greater the security to individual rights." In 1871, Susan B. Anthony addressed the territorial legislature, and she and the Bigelows, along with a number of other local suffragists, worked together to form the very first Washington Territory Women's Suffrage Association, and they held their convention here in Olympia in November of 1871. This really set a wonderful framework for advocacy for women to gain the right to vote, and that came to fruition in 1883 when the territorial legislature enacted women's right to vote in Washington. And it was only women in Wyoming and Utah that had the right to vote after the Civil War, before women in Washington. It was quite challenging, as you might imagine. There was concern that women would vote for prohibition. Besides having the right to vote, they could also serve on juries. And there were a series of cases that came before the Territorial Supreme Court, first upholding the right to vote, and then in 1887, women's right to vote was invalidated, really on a technicality. Finally, in 1910, women in Washington permanently achieved the right to vote, and we're just the 5th state in the Union where women had the right to vote. The Bigelows both lived good long lives. Daniel Bigelow died in 1905. He was often called upon to reminisce about the early days of the territory. His wife, Anne Elizabeth, lived even longer into the 1920s. She was often called a fine businesswoman. She too wrote a lot of reminiscences about what life was like in the early days of the territory. Their legacy really is as a family that was very much community builders, people who believed in the new territory, who believed in making the new territory and state a better place to live, and really wanted to work towards that. And I think they found a fertile ground here in the new territory of Washington, and during their lives to live out that vision of what a community could be.